Thanks very much to everybody who has joined us today. My name is Susan Smith. I'm one of the co-founders of Canada 2020, which is Canada's leading independent think tank. And in my day job, I'm actually a small business owner for a company called Blue Sky Strategy Group. So I'm very interested to hear all about this conversation today. Canada 2020 is partnered with the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy at the University of Ottawa, as well as Global Progress, to launch the Recovery Project. The Recovery Project is all about thinking ahead from the COVID-19 pandemic. What happens after, how we recover economically, fiscally, and institutionally, and build stronger economies and better policy. Our topic today is called SMEs, the long tail of the small business recovery. Today, our conversation is focusing completely on how small and medium-sized businesses in Canada are coping with the major economic impacts of this pandemic. We'll discuss some of the supporting mechanisms available to SMEs, how different sectors are navigating through the challenges, and what the road to recovery might look like. I'm joined today by a fantastic group of guests. You can all see them on your screen. I've got Michael Denham, the President and CEO of the Business Development Bank of Canada, Dr. Sandip Lalli, the President and CEO of the Calgary Chamber of Commerce, Rodney Macdonald, the Vice President of Corporate Affairs and Global Public Policy for Intuit. He's joining us from Toronto. And JP Gladu, most recently the President and CEO of the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business. And I think a COVID casualty, JP, as you were just about to start as the CEO of Canada's largest First Nations oil and gas service company. Is that correct?
Yeah, the Boucher Group up in Fort McMurray. And unfortunately, as you've alluded to, timing in life, I did resign from the CCAB way back in December, a long take up to bring in the new CEO, who's doing an amazing job top of the bowl, and just about to head out. All my stuff's packed up, and unfortunately, oil price and COVID did not allow the company. They're in severe contraction mode.
Yeah, we look forward to the insights you've got almost from a personal perspective, and as well as what you can share in the First Nations community and the oil and gas sector as well. Thank you, all of you, for joining us today. And thank you to our folks online. We've got a good number of people on board so far, and I know that that number will continue to grow over the call. We'll have a conversation ourselves with the folks who are on the screen, and people are able to send in their questions, and we'll be able to read them later on and try and give some feedback too. I'd encourage all of you to tweet if you can, at Canada 2020 and at RecoverProj, that's P-R-O-J. Tweet about what you're hearing, tell people all about it. So let's get started. I think, Michael, I'm going to start with a question with you. Sooner or later, I think we're going to start to think about this time as BC, before COVID. And in the small business universe, I'm wondering from your BDC perspective, if you can tell us a little bit what it looked like from a numbers, GDP contribution, the sectors, what the employment numbers were broadly. Give us a little snapshot of where we were before the carpet got pulled out from under us.
Yep. Happy to, Susan. And thanks for the question. Thanks for hosting this. And I want to also thank my fellow panelists for being here. It'll be, I'm really looking forward to learning about learning from your perspectives of the topic as well. So Susan, just our perspective on this. So BDC, we're a Crown Corporation, we've been around for 75 years. We have 60,000 clients. We describe ourselves as Canada's only bank that focuses exclusively on entrepreneurs. So we are well positioned to answer the question. And just so the viewers and listeners know, during this period of crisis, we're an investor and a lender, and we're kind of staying within our swim lane. So we've introduced some new working capital loans, some accessible loans. We have a convertible notes product for VC-backed companies. We're providing capital to banks to extend their credit. So a whole host of things to basically get credit moving and make sure that SMEs and entrepreneurs have access to the liquidity they need. But to answer your question, Susan, the pre-COVID, the role of SMEs was critically important, and frankly, in many ways, it had been a great point in time for SMEs. I mean, they represented about 90% of all private sector workforce, 50% of our GDP, 42% of our exports. I'm talking about companies that are below 500 employees, and about 21% of Canada's intellectual property. So huge contributors to the economy. And one point just to close on is this is a very small subset of SMEs and entrepreneurs, but we're a very active venture capital investor. And the venture capital segment in Canada, these technology companies, actually hadn't been as robust as it was going back till the late 1990s in terms of deals, quality of companies, growth of companies, financing, et cetera. So the pre-COVID days were actually, especially for this part of the economy, extremely good. And we're all hoping and frankly confident that eventually we'll get back there.
Right, thanks, Michael. I appreciate it. Rodney, JP, and Sandip, before we go into the next question, why don't I give you each a couple seconds to give us a snapshot of your organization so we can understand top line the perspectives that you've been looking at this whole COVID crisis and dealing with it. Rodney, why don't you go ahead?
Sure. Well, Intuit, which is not really a household name, is the maker of QuickBooks and TurboTax, which are a bit more familiar. So I guess today I'm wearing my QuickBooks hat, as QuickBooks is an AI-driven small business platform that Canadian small and micro businesses use to manage their finances, to interact with their bank, as well as their money in, money out insights that are all provided for them through our platform. So that product has over 600,000 Canadian small businesses actively using this platform to understand the health of their business. And that's some of the data insights that I'll bring today.
Sure, great. Thank you very much. Sandip, tell us, you're based in Calgary, who's really experiencing some tough times, a double whammy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so thank you to the fellow panelists and for having this conversation. It is so important for SMEs and for everybody to understand that they are the bedrock of our community, of our economy. And so for us here in Calgary, the Calgary Chamber is a 130-year organization, and our purpose is to nourish, power, and inspire our business community so that they can go and nourish, power, and inspire the world. And that's why our mantra is it's grow time, because there is really no other way to go other than to grow and to move. But growth has to come from within. Growth has to come from within our SME community. So that's who we are. And what we've been working on with COVID is around Here for YYC, which is an initiative and a rally cry to make sure that we don't forget about our most vulnerable, don't forget about our small entrepreneur, our gig economy. Thank you, Michael, for the VC side of things, because our innovation economy is how we see things moving forward. But coming into this, we were in a tough spot. And for 2020, our VC has forecasted that Alberta will have about 200,000 job loss, leading up to 400,000 by the end, and we will be at about 20% unemployment. Wow. And all of that is not in one sector. And I think if your audience and everybody listening, Calgary and Alberta is more than oil and gas. And yes, that sector has been hit hard, and that's our double whammy. But our third piece is that we came in very weak compared to the rest of the provinces in Canada. Mm-hmm.
That's tough, and we'll circle back to that. I'd be interested in hearing some of the specifics. I'm going to give JP a chance to talk a little bit about some of the things he's seen, and I'm going to start off. You can give a bit of your perspective, JP, in your former role at the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, but I'll ask you a specific question as well, is what kind of impact has COVID had on First Nations SMEs?
Right. Thank you for that. Well, just to build on Sandip, I am one of those numbers that was almost employed in Alberta. And just as an example, the Boucher Group, they had laid off about 500 employees. And they were a team of about 1,030 or so. Like all their executives, they reduced their business lines from 3 down to 2. So it was a significant impact to that one company. My former role as the CEO of CCAB, President CEO, we did a lot of data-driven work. The organization has really proliferated with the stats. And just to throw some of them out to give you a perspective of how large the Indigenous economy is, it's over $30 billion. And those are figures in 2016 with the TD Economic Report. So we know that number was growing significantly from there. 54,000 Indigenous businesses from coast to coast to coast, pretty much competing in every sector that you can think of, including gig economy, technology, the traditional natural resource projects. And the other significant portion of the economic engine with the Indigenous communities is the growing capacity and presence of community economic development corporations. I've got some interesting stats to share with you and the listeners here in a bit. So there has been a significant growth, which most Canadians often don't witness or are aware of, that has happened in the Indigenous community. Alberta is a powerhouse. BC is a powerhouse of Indigenous businesses, and there's definitely some strong bright spots across the country as well. But you know, the barriers to a lot of communities, and our friends at BDC would know this, Michael would know this, is that getting access to capital is something that's very significant, a big barrier for many Indigenous SMEs, as well as getting the goods and the tools and services to help them proliferate and grow, and then of course human capital. So again, similar to Sandip's examples, the Indigenous SME market definitely comes in with some constraints that limit their ability to start up and grow.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, and we'll also get into what kind of supports are available too, so we can we'll pivot over to that. Rodney, you mentioned that you have some you're looking at things granularly. It's 600,000 businesses. And I understand there's data that you guys have been sharing with the Bank of Canada. Maybe you can shed a bit of light on that and what you're seeing in the impacts of COVID on these small businesses.
Yeah, my pleasure. So as I mentioned, the QuickBooks user base in Canada is very large. And when we say small businesses at QuickBooks, we really are talking about the very small. We really aren't playing in the M of SMB. It's really, you know, I think most measurements are once you get up to 80 to 100, you're touching the M. But most of our users are really in the very small. Your family-owned shop, your independent contractor, your service sector guys, gals who come around and do renos. You know, I'm talking very small businesses, and these are obviously the most vulnerable aspect, and yet the true backbone of the economy. And the Bank of Canada, through kind of an informal discussion, was looking for data sources like QuickBooks data, like Shopify data, like Amazon data that could help them see in different terms than just relying on GDP data, which they get only really quarterly, to give them more of a live stream to see when we hit a bottom and when we start to see a recovery. And I'll get into more of this in the subsequent questions. However, one shocking aspect that came glaring at us from our very first data poll, and by the way, we've never done this before, believe it or not, we haven't actually mined our data for insights, economic. And when we did our first poll, we thought, you know, let's look at things like aging invoices, cash balances, and someone said, hey, let's look at the creation of records of employment. Because QuickBooks Payroll, QuickBooks Payroll is the most widely used small and micro business payroll platform. And so everyone on this call, if you're Canadian, you know the importance of creating a record of employment. It must be done when you let someone go in order for that individual to file for EI. And in the first data poll, which would have been the second week of March, we saw a 17x increase of records of employment over 2019. I mean, it was just a giant spike. And then in week 2, we saw that come down. And in week 3, we saw that come down. And then in week 4, the creation of records of employment from our user base has returned to below 2019 levels. And, you know, I got to be careful. Like, we're still learning how to pull out biases from the data and not draw too quick conclusions. However, you know, it appears that certain small businesses were super cautious at the very front end and thought, I'm downsizing, I'm scaling down, or I'm shutting down entirely, where others haven't. And so I think we saw that really fast bleed of certain types of businesses where others have held on. And we're starting to see that more and more from the data, that certain types of small businesses are not only just not impacted, but actually greatly benefiting from the situation, especially if you're an online digital native. So I'll stop there, but that's just one of the types of insights we've seen early on. And it could be, and I know we're going to get to a subsequent question around the government supports, but it could be indicative of the confidence that was reinstilled into the market with the wage subsidy and the small business loans that could have stopped some of that initial knee-jerk reaction.
Yeah. JP, I see you nodding your head. Do you have any insights on that from a First Nations perspective in terms of the beginning of the COVID crisis to the middle to, well, we're not at the end. Are we still in the middle? I hope it's the middle. I hope it's still not the beginning.
I hope we're at the middle. And actually, when Rodney was going through his figures, I started to put that in my mindset that I would suspect. And my sister's a small micro business owner with a couple staff in Kelowna, interior designer, decorator, and she has been set up to through the emergency wage subsidy program, and I think that's, as she would say, saving her butt. So I would agree, Rodney. I think part of that data that you're seeing below the 2019 is probably because of that wage subsidy program. It'd be really interesting to see when you do the mining of the data to see what that actually looks like. In the Indigenous world, there's a little bit of a delay, and you often, well, we've been listening every morning to the Prime Minister and the announcements of the programs coming out. Some of the Indigenous organizations like the Economic Development Corporations weren't initially eligible for the same emergency wage subsidy program that every other business was because of their status on reserves and the way that it was written. Because of their tax implications, they were not eligible. And I've got some really great friends over at Mikisew Cree. Sandip, you might know the Mikisew folks up in north of Fort McMurray. They were in a very tough place on a regular basis. And they're like, we're going to have to take further action if we're not able to be eligible. Like in the $1 million plus is what they were going to be kind of putting out for salaries. And luckily the government did turn that around. I know CCAB was Tabitha's team was very instrumental in getting that to the table. And again, I think that probably would save off, it's similar, I mean, obviously it's a different scale, Rodney, but I'm sure that was a big reason why that they were not issuing as many employment records.
Mm-hmm. Sandip, you painted a pretty stark picture in Calgary. 200,000 jobs lost already, another 200,000 potentially to come by the end of 2020. Maybe tell us a little bit about the specifics in Calgary from a COVID perspective, what you're seeing there beyond oil and gas.
Yeah, absolutely. Just a little bit on JP and Rodney's comments about the wage. The other piece I would add in there is that we're waiting for long-term stability. So for those government programs to continue, because what we're hearing is, like, from restaurant owners and others, is if I can open at 50%, but I still need the wage subsidy, that is critical for me to stabilize. So I would say just watch that in your data, Rodney, as that picks up. And then Susan, the 200,000 jobs that we've lost, RBC is forecasting that to occur over this period here through June probably or something, and then ending the year at 400,000.
Yeah. Well, that's still a huge hit.
It's a huge hit. No, absolutely. And you know what? It's really the key here for us is that it's a service-led downturn, as it is across the country. And for us, especially coming in with our oil and gas sector being hit hard and being constrained coming in, you did have your service companies, you had your engineering companies, you have our hospitality industry, our tourism industry, and then you have your frontline service retail businesses. And so all of that coupled together, along with our freelance economy, we have a very strong freelance economy with respect to innovation and technology companies servicing in. And so with the government programs, or even with the downturn, they don't have, their customers have closed up, so it's, if I had a book of work saying I'm going to start in January, or if I was say I was going to start in September, even September is off the books. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so that's the conversations companies are having with us now is, okay, it's great that the programs are in. I'm not sure if I'm going to stay open past June, because I don't have a book of work to go to, because the customers I normally have are constraining themselves. So that's why I say it's broader than just one sector. Our health sciences, our agriculture, our farmers are doing well. They're seeding, but it's hard to get a farmer to say things are going well. But that aside, for example, Farm Credit Canada opening up liquidity really helped them early on to see a line of sight. And so when we look at that, we look at the railroads being available to take grain and others, pulses and things to market. They're seeing some optimism there. So
Good. Well, I hope there's a glimmer of hope in the Calgary economy. It's been battered around for a while now. Michael, BDC, much like the folks at Intuit as well, you guys get to see the national picture. Maybe shed a bit of insight on the sectors that have been hit hardest through COVID. I think there are some obvious ones. Will you be interested in your insights there, as well as maybe some of the surprise ones that we didn't really think about?
Yeah, so when the crisis first happened, a lot of the talk was kind of optimistic around this V, where the economy will kind of shut down, kind of bounce right back. But as you follow, no one really knows where we're headed. But when you follow all the various projections that macroeconomists are doing, and you kind of look, we're going to get back to sort of end of 2019 levels of output. But some of those crossover points are now getting into kind of late 2022, et cetera. So I think we've all realized that this is going to take a lot longer than most of us would like. And what's instructive is every country is different, but what's instructive is you look at some of the data from China, and they're sort of 5 months, if you will, from when things really started. So the equivalent for us would be kind of August timeframe. And look at some of the industries, and I mean, the brewery beer consumption's just down to 60% of what it was. Consumer goods are 45%, hotels at 33%, flight travel down at 20%, and the growth lines are actually fairly flat. So I think and again, China's a very different situation to what we have here, but it's instructive in the sense that the worst of the crisis in terms of lockdown and confinement is behind them. So there is some, I think, reason to reflect on their experience. But much like Sandip said, I think the sectors that are hardest hit are the ones that are going to have the hardest time recovering. So it is the tourism, it's the travel, it's the food and accommodation, it's the retail. I think we just need to be cognizant of that as we think about the many things that need to be done to get the entire economy working again.
Let's talk about that a little bit. Michael, I'm actually going to pivot back to you because I know you have some data about confidence, how people feel, as small businesses feel about where things are going right now. Can you shed a bit of light on that for us?
Sure. So, the data, frankly, that Rodney has is actually, given the range of it, is an incredibly complete database. So I was worried as he started his story, it would be contrary to what we found through our surveys, but the nice thing is they're consistent. So every 2 weeks, we're surveying thousands of entrepreneurs with a standard set of questions. What happened? We see the same trend that Rodney actually sees more precisely than we do, which is there was a real sense of panic back in mid-March or so. But every 2 weeks as we do the survey, folks are still deeply concerned, but the level of panic is behind us. So for example, you look at the concerns people had about ability to keep folks on the payroll. 75% of folks were concerned back in mid-March. That number's down to about 40. Companies' ability to pay their debts, that was close to 60, is now down to 40. And I have the same explanation for this that Rodney provided, which is now that we're into it, I think the most fragile companies have probably issued those records of employment. And with the whole range of other supports being provided around wage, payroll, et cetera, I think companies are seeing there's enough out there right now to at least have line of sight to surviving, which again, in an absolute sense, isn't great, but in a relative sense, is huge progress from where we were.
Right, Sandip, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I would concur that in our calls, that's what we're hearing, and is the fact that there was that panic in March. But that's why I say June 30th. So that's kind of what we're also hearing, is that, yes, I was fragile. Yes, I was stable. The money came in, 6 weeks later, but I had a line of sight. But now my fixed costs, my commercial rent, all of that stuff's, kind of sorted. But what happens after that? So there's almost like this psychological go, no go that's going to happen in June. because September is sort of that, unofficial start of the business year. And so that's what we're hearing in our calls, and our surveys are out as well. But we've been doing voice-to-voice phone calls with the business community, and there is that June timeframe. So I would just add that to Michael and Rodney's comments, is that June really seems to be some psychological marker of, do I go or not go with my business?
Let's do a little bit of a reminder. I think that's very interesting. It will be interesting to see what the psychological effect with people is at the end of June if we can't go. I was speaking to a politician in Northern Canada who said there'd been a conversation last week, and some of our senior business leaders are saying we've got to come back, but we can't rush back too quickly because we don't have the ability to fix it all over again, right? I mean, there are billions of dollars in supports, and I'd like to get into that a little bit. Billions of dollars of supports that the government has put in place to try and help small business and help keep people fed and keep people housed and keep businesses going, keep people employed. But if we rush back too quickly, if we're not ready, and I think June is a good line of sight as if we do the go slow, because another, a boomerang effect we couldn't sustain, I don't think, as a country. But let's talk about what is there, and that's giving people hope or enabling these records of employment numbers to diminish over time. JP, can you speak a little bit, just to remind our listeners who are small business owners themselves, what's available there if you're a First Nation small business owner, if you're partnered with a small business? And then Michael, maybe I'll pivot to you just to talk about a little bit about some of the things that are in place through BDC and others. JP?
Well, it was great to see, and interestingly, the numbers greater than we've ever seen before as far as capitalization to support SMEs. I think it was $306 million that were allocated to support SMEs, which, again, just to reflect on my sister, she's able to access that $40,000 for the Indigenous SMEs. I don't know if it's different in your world, Michael. $30,000, I believe, is an interest-free loan, and there's also a $10,000 portion grant, which is helping those SMEs get through. And the other thing that I think that really does, and often when I was a CEO of CCAB, I would often get, well, what separates an Indigenous entrepreneur from those that are non-Indigenous? And it's that tight commitment and proximity to community. And you can really see, and especially in, every community, they try to come together, but First Nation communities, quite often, you have nowhere else to go. So you are entrenched in your community for the most part. And I think you're starting to see a lot of community give back, support, and you can start to see that emanating through community and just that human spirit. And I think that goes across cultures. But so that's part of it. But I think one of the challenges, though, in the federal funding was that there wasn't anything designated there for the larger corporations as far as loan support, which I've heard from some of my colleagues has been a little bit of a challenge. But if I just kind of go into some of the stats that CCAB just produced in their survey, there's about 90% of them were very or somewhat concerned. Close to 80% of them have experienced some pretty high impact. 3/4 of the SMEs have, and this is no surprise, I've seen a drop in their sales. But I think on the positive side, and we look at the Indigenous economic stability, or at least some strong base. CCAB interviewed 49 Aboriginal Economic Development Corporations, and they have partnerships with a lot of non-Indigenous organizations, and that's where I think a lot of our might, or a lot of our ability as a country to come together, to work together. And those 49 ADCs, amongst them, there are 296 businesses between them. Many of them are partnerships with non-Indigenous economic development corporations. So you can start to see that Canada's in it together, which is really amazing. And out of that, every EDC has about 278 employees, with their subsidiaries of another 150 people. That's over 12,000 jobs within those 49 AEDCs. And so what really brings positivity to my heart is that a lot of those, and Alberta is a prime example of seeing where Indigenous and non-Indigenous people are in it. They're suffering together, but in suffering together, you also build stronger relationships, and those relationships, when you come out of challenges like this, will be stronger as a result of it. And that gives me hope.
Good. Well, we need some hope at this point in time, that's for sure. Michael, let's talk about what's giving SMEs hope from a program perspective. BDC is the focal point for a lot of the federal government assistance. Can you remind us what's there and what's available for people?
Sure. So a lot of steps have been taken to ensure that the credit flows in Canada. So BDC was recapitalized. BDC and EDC together have injected likely over $40 billion through the financial institution. So if you're an SME, you should talk to your bank, and there's an EDC guarantee and a BDC co-lend product that mentioned, but the banks take 20% of the amount, EDC and BDC take 80%. So it's designed to enhance the lending and the credit coming from the banks. A part of that JP mentioned is the Canadian Emergency Business Account, which is there for all Canadian businesses. And the government continues to refine its approach to eligibility to make sure that folks get access to this. And that's up to $40,000 loan to an SME. And if paid back for a certain period of time, 25% is forgivable. And then, as JP mentioned, there is some work underway, some thinking around bringing somebody to market for larger companies, the mid-market and larger companies, but that's still under consideration. And then parallel to that, since a lot of companies can't bear debt, don't want debt, the credit's not what they need right now, there's the wage subsidy that we described, which is meant to bear part of payroll costs. There's some issues around tax deferrals. There's a plan around rent relief, which is going to be very important to a lot of companies, especially retailers. And at the same time, the government's also made additional funding available to organizations like NACA to support the Aboriginal financial institutions, to Futurepreneur, to the regional development authorities, and other parts of the government to make sure that entrepreneurs, SMEs have access at multiple points to what they need, be it loans, grants, subsidies, etc., to again get access to the liquidity they need to keep moving forward.
So there's lots there. Rodney, yes, I was just going to ask you, are you seeing people accessing these, or would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, well, we don't have direct data into how many of our small businesses have accessed the various supports, although we are prompting our users when they do sign into QuickBooks to update their transactions or to do their monthly bookkeeping. We're doing auto calculation to be able to say, based on your inputs, we believe you do qualify for the wage subsidy and or the small business loan. Although, going back to, I think, Susan, what you were saying a little while ago, one of the concerns we have is that we're seeing aging invoices become a real concern. And so what we're hearing from some of our retail partners and from some of our small businesses who actually supply the larger businesses who shall remain nameless, even large businesses are starting to go from a 30-day guarantee of payment to a 90-day guarantee of payment. Now, if you're self-employed or you're an entrepreneur, that's a death knell. And so that's a growing concern. With regard to, where was I going now? With regard to the supports and whether they are hitting the mark, I mean, it's obviously an enormous challenge for the government to administer these kind of outlays in such a short period of time. One area where we saw a bit of a gap was the requirement of payroll in order to access the loan. And then the government, I think, also saw the light on that and brought the payroll requirement down significantly. However, there's still a large number of self-employed who retain daily labor. Think of someone doing a home reno. They're going to bring in a buddy who's also an independent contractor and bring him in on the job, but that's not necessarily a payroll relationship. And so a lot of independent contractors are not going to be able to show even $20,000 in payroll per year to access the wage subsidy. So that's a concern. I believe there's got to be a way that they can be a bit more accommodating for this very fast-growing segment of the economy, which is self-employed or independent contractors. And I think the government was probably thinking, well, at that low end, those individuals, those small businesses will also be able to apply for the CERB, And now they're bringing in the rent, the commercial rent program. So I think it is starting to build out a much broader foundation.
Michael, did you want to comment on that, or?
No, I agree. I share those views.
Sandip, are you seeing that the federal programs that have been put in place, I'm not familiar with what's been put in place for Alberta, but is it making a difference for some of the SMEs there?
Yeah, I would say it's making a difference for the ones that qualify, but there is more that don't qualify, and it's those self-employed and the ones that had the dividend. So that dividend piece got, adjusted, and it was all slowly coming through. But in the long term, like, the piece that's still missing is, if I'm self-employed and I have one person working for me or whatever, there's this assumption that I can bear more debt, and I can apply for the $40,000 loan. I can take care of, like, if I'm running a company with 1 or 2, 3 people, I don't have the debt burden I can take to even maintain my own household, let alone save the people that I have employed with me. And so that's what's falling through the cracks. And so what folks are doing, and they'll start to do more of, is, okay, well, maybe I close my business and then I don't service my customer base. Or do I now try to look for a larger employer and then just really get out of the space of having being a job creator? And that's the piece that's going to be the long-term recovery piece that we need to keep in mind, is if all of these folks start to shut in, where do the job creators go? And how do you actually recover? Like, for us in Alberta, we don't have any fallacy of a V or even a U. It's an L. We went down, and it's going to be a long way back.
A lefty hockey stick for you guys.
And so that's why we're really focused on the job creators, to make sure that we sustain an economy that enables more job creation. So the innovation economy. And so the folks that are falling through are the folks that we really want to make sure that these federal programs, continue to adjust. And we're not seeing that happen quick enough for those folks.
Mm-hmm. Michael, you wanted to jump in there?
Yeah, and Sandip knows this, but just to bridge a little bit to the other end of the size spectrum, and looking at the E&P, the oil producing companies in Alberta.
Yes.
Given all that's going on right now, we've seen what the oil prices are. What we're trying to do with EDC and others is to put in place enough liquidity so that these companies can get from today's environment, which is really, really difficult, through to a better environment, say 3-4 years down the road, at which point there'll be more options. And over the course of this period of time, there's some consolidation, some strategic moves that are required. But the hope is that this liquidity provides at least a base platform of stability on which these companies can continue to operate, can make their strategic moves, and as a result, make sure that the country continues to have a vibrant oil and gas sector.
Yeah, and we're counting on that as a table stake, actually. So thank you, Michael, for highlighting that. For our large corps, that liquidity piece and the ability to see that through the next 4 or 5 years is a real, that's a positive piece that every Albertan will go, okay, they, like, A, the country hears us, and B, there's stability in this economy. And as I talk about those gig economy folks, those are their customers. So we need their customers to be stable.
Yeah. I want to, in a minute, I'm going to go to some of the questions we've received for people online. A reminder to people, you can just hit the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and you can type in a question. We've received a few. I want to talk about looking forward. And I sort of joked about whether we're in the middle of this or near the end of this or not. I think we're still in the middle, but it's time to start looking forward. And we know the officials in Ottawa, I can tell you from the conversations I'm having with people, that officials in government departments are looking forward. They're looking at what we need to do to get the economy back on its feet again, what kind of stimulus projects we need to have, what kind of programs do we need to have in place to keep people in our businesses and our small businesses going. So my next question to the group is, what do you anticipate the SME landscape looking like in the recovery phase? Obviously, we'll have lost some businesses along the way, but who's going to survive? What kind of growth or new businesses are emerging that you're seeing? And who do you think, what sectors do you think will be able to recover the most smoothly? JP, I'll start with you, and give us your perspective on that.
Well, I think again, I was alluding to the economic development corporations, which are community owned. So just for listeners, it's a development corporation. It's like I wouldn't say this amongst my First Nation colleagues, but it's like a crown corporation that's owned by the community. And because of that, there is some longer term stability because of the transfer payments that happen to communities, and communities will decide on where they dispense some of the resources within 5 buckets, one of them being economic development. So economic development and development economy is important. And what this has all brought to light for me, and as somebody that's led Indigenous business in the country, as well as being now a small SME myself, a micro SME, is that this has brought light to a lot of Indigenous communities. And I think it's also brought light to Canada as a whole. For a very long time, our people have been very much forced to the peripheral because of a lot of colonialistic practices. And we're starting to see the acute pain of not having an economy and having our people not employed. And we look at the stability of Canada and developing certainty around specifically our natural resource projects, how fundamentally important it is to make sure that Indigenous communities are empowered through an economy. As an example, when we look at the LNG project, you have one section of one First Nation out of about 20 that are pushing back. And the other 20 are supported because there's an economy, because there's jobs, because there's something in it for them, because there's potentially equity positions for communities. If those communities didn't have anything as far as economy, that project would be incredibly more challenged, if not impossible to overcome. So I think this is a flashpoint for Canada to look more carefully at how we support Indigenous economies, the SMEs, the economic development corporations, as well as equity positions into major infrastructure projects, as an example. So for me, it's a pause, and it's also a pause for our own Indigenous communities to understand the impact that they can be having in building their economies with their small business owners. It's an inflection point, and I'm hopeful for the future that we're going to do things differently than we have in the past.
Yeah, hopefully we've learned. And we continue to learn from this. I mean, if we don't learn as a country writ large on the business side of things, and I think business owners are also learning. Rodney, you're seeing people who have encountered difficulties that they never have. And I think as Canadians, we probably didn't realize how close to the line our local shops were, our local restaurants were, our hair salons were. And we won't know that till it all starts up all over again. Rodney, what are you seeing, or what do you anticipate the people who will be able to make the smoothest transition back into business in this post-COVID world? I mean, spacing in restaurants, limits on how many people can come in through the door. What do you think?
Yeah, look, I think the limits on who can come through the door, that's going to be short-term pain. Eventually, that will be lifted. And so if we look that far ahead, I think of one of the stats that I've talked about for many years in Ottawa, which is that any small business who adopts a financial management system or tool early on in their phase of startup has a 44% greater chance of surviving the first 5 years. And we know that in Canada, actually, it's very similar in all advanced democracies or advanced economies. About 50% of small businesses fail within the first 5 years. That's true in Canada, in the UK, in Western Europe. In developing economies, it's much higher, obviously. It's up closer to 75% in some of the places I work. But digitization is going to need to be a central plank in the government's policy with regards to recovery. Anything the government can do to encourage the adoption of digital financial management tools, financial literacy, financial education, very early on. We know that when small businesses, they want to start up their gig, whether it's a baker or an electrician, they want to do that. They don't want to focus on books. They don't want to focus on talking to the banks or talking to alternative lenders and all the different ways to think about how they set themselves up financially. And once they get going, it becomes even less likely that they'll do so because they're now in the spin of things. But the earlier, at the very outset, if they can adopt digital tools for managing their finances, they have a much greater chance of success.
Okay, thanks, Rodney. Sandip, I'm going to combine the question I asked you with one I have online here. This question says all conversation, well, they're talking about saving existing businesses, but it says it looks like Alberta has no choice but to foster and promote new and innovative businesses, new startups, and an innovation economy. And the question is, where should we, new ventures, turn to for help in a devastated economy? But first, I'd like you to talk a little bit about where you see the direction of some of these new businesses could be, where the opportunity is. I mean, if you could pivot your company into making PPE, guess what, folks? We're going to need that for a long time. I think more domestic agriculture production or better supply chain on that, I think is going to be a big area. But why don't you talk a little bit, Sandip, about where the growth opportunities that you see are in Alberta, e-commerce, tech, new ventures, and where do they turn for help?
Yeah, no, for sure. You know, we've been doing at the Chamber, we've been doing webinars every day at 11 o'clock with the business community. So 2 business leaders talking, started March 15th. It started with panic, but then they got into creative ideas of how do they recover? What do they see in the long game? What are those table stakes? And we actually had Stoney Nakoda Nation and the Indian Resources Council. So like, it's the whole gamut. It's interesting how the whole ecosystem has come together. Construction has come, tourism has come. We were just talking to some office supplies, trust, all of that, all of those things. And everybody's got great ideas, but it does come down to part of your business has to have a technology component to it. It's your fail-safe. It's your backstop. It's not anything to do with government funding or anything. It has to be a core part of your business model. And it goes beyond digitization. You've got to be able to learn how to make money with that tool. And it's a tool. It's not a competitive advantage anymore. And then the conversation quickly goes to rural broadband.
Yes.
How are you going to communicate and do this and have an economy that is an SME that goes all over the place without broadband that works? And we've all lived in different cities and we all know the pinch points. It's like everybody turning on the dishwasher, the laundry machine, and everything at the same time. Oh, there must be lots of webinars going on because I can't see or talk to anybody. And so that became really critical to say the business model, what utility tools do I have? And then for the companies, the other ideas that have come up have been about scaling. How do I find new customers? If everybody I'm selling to is having, you know, constraints on them, how do I find new customers? And in this e-commerce space, how do I do B2B? How do I sell digitally? How do I keep my book warm on the revenue side if I can't sell the way I normally sell? So companies that can figure out how to sell virtually on a continuous basis and have a broadband or a digital utility in their business model are the ones that are going to recover and set themselves up. Those are the ideas we're hearing back.
Or if you're a company that can teach people how to sell virtually
as
well.
Yeah,
as
so
well.
Services, yeah, and so that's what one of our webinars is about, is how do you sell virtually? And the chambers across, so I know JP's talking about economic development and chambers, and all of those associations have become actually more critically important now as policy changes are required so that we can have a level footing for a foundation for growth of our businesses, which leads to the question around innovation in Calgary. And I don't want anybody to think it's something we feel we had to do. It's something we've been doing, but not talking about. You can't start from scratch today. And so we have Amy, which is an artificial intelligence. It's the third ranked in the world. And so you don't just happen to have that, right? Like that's a commitment. And so I would say, you know, reach out to the chamber in Calgary or in Edmonton, reach out to Innovate YEG or to Innovate Alberta Innovates. We have Platform here in Calgary. We have Startup Calgary as part of our Calgary Economic Development team. So everybody's already here. We have Creative Destruction Labs, which is something that goes across the country. So there are places to reach out, but if the listener wants to reach out to the chamber. We will point you in the right direction. We've actually put forward innovation policy. But I do think if you're in Eastern Canada, it's like Mars, but not Mars. Like that's what we have here.
And that's not the planet.
And that's not the planet Mars, exactly.
That's in Toronto. And
and
Sandip, I think it's probably fair to say that the programs you've got in place, you're an incredibly innovative chamber, but in the other big urban centers, there are probably similar things in place for entrepreneurs. And then there's the Canadian Chamber of Commerce itself. If you're in a smaller center and you're listening and you're an SME, there's an opportunity to tap into that. I don't think you're going to turn anybody away because if they want to access your webinars or your programs, right? It's not geographically limited, right? I think that's really important.
Right, Susan. And that's the other beauty of this, right? Is everybody can have these. We've heard from people in other parts of the country, but the other part is if you connect in and you're in Kelowna, like JP's sister, you still are part of the chamber movement. You still have full access to all those resources. And so that's what I would encourage people to do. And nobody in this country is starting from scratch on innovation.
Yeah, Michael, I'm coming to you, but I just want to acknowledge one thing that Sandip said and speak to it in the context of JP. You talked about rural broadband and access to broadband. I mean, for any of you political nerds, hands up, that watched the House of Commons go virtual, Seamus O'Regan couldn't get in, the Minister of Natural Resources. He was having a terrible time from connectivity. Indigenous communities suffer from that. Correct.
I, as a prime example, I'm going up to my reserve midweek and I'm setting up shop on a house, and I have, if I'm lucky, one bar, not even digital. So I have to, I'm going to have to figure that out. Am I supposed to do business with one bar cellular service?
Yeah, that's pretty tough. And if you're a small business, you're trying to sell things and you're trying to upload your products and your photos of your offerings to people, or you want to do a Zoom call. You can't do a Zoom call in one bar. That's tough. I know the government made an announcement about rural broadband next week. I don't have the details on it, but I'm sure you can find it. If you go to Industry Canada's website, you can have a look. Michael, I'm going to put you, you've been sitting quietly for a while. I'm going to put you on the spot in terms of the sectors that you see being able to recover the most smoothly post-pandemic. I mean, I think the lights on the Canadian economy are going to be on a dimmer switch. It's not going to be flick on and off. We're going to slowly lift that up and brighten this economy. But broadly, give us 3 sectors that you think are going to be able to pivot well post-pandemic.
Well, I think can I just a little bit there? I think there are 2 big opportunity areas. A lot of sectors fit into them. I think there will be, and you see it already, a real reconsideration of some important supply chains. I think our health services supply chain is going to be reconsidered. I think, frankly, our food supply chain may be reconsidered. And that'll have all sorts of opportunities in it for logistics companies, for manufacturing companies, for packaging companies, et cetera. And second, you don't want to get too carried away, but to some of the points that Rodney was making, Canada has actually been relatively unsophisticated in terms of SMEs going digital. And even though 2/3 of Canadians buy stuff through e-commerce, only 5% of SMEs have a means to take online payments. And I think what we're seeing now is a rapid acceleration of everybody recognizing the need to go all in with respect to digital. So, and you see it all the data, just the DIY, food products, furniture, et cetera, they're up 3x their digital transactions versus pre-crisis. And I think that's going to stick with us. So I think there's a set of opportunities and challenges around these key supply chains. I think there are lots of opportunities across many industries to become more kind of digital and having e-commerce at the core. And those, I think, will lead to kind of macro lasting effects, if I were to bet, of what we're enduring right now.
Okay. I'm conscious of the time. We have about 5 minutes left, so I have a couple more questions I'd like to ask you. One is a reader question or a listener observer question. Dina Grazer, thank you for your question. What kind of continued support do you think that SMEs will need and should have access to after the end of June? I mean, typically our governments, federal and provincial, have supported SMEs. There have always been programs in place, never to this level because it's about people doing business. But do you think the landscape's going to change in terms of the kinds of supports? How do you think wage subsidies are going to stay in play for longer, if they should? Rodney, what do you think? Do you want to give me a quick answer on that?
Yeah, I don't know if this will be a very precise answer, but I bet you Michael and others will have more precision. You know, I work in 3 markets, Brazil, Mexico, and Canada. And what I'm hearing in Brazil is frighteningly similar. to what I'm hearing from my friends who have their own businesses, which is that a lot of really small businesses are existing right now on the good graces of their landlord, on the good graces of their hydro provider, their internet provider, their cell provider, their vendors, their suppliers. And there's a lot of goodwill that's kind of going around, but it's kind of reaching a breaking point where it's just, there's so much knock-on effect. And the fear is that there's going to be a big wave of closures and bankruptcies in June. And so I think that, I mean, that sounds like a doomsday scenario. But I think whether that truly comes to fulfillment or not, the barrier for re-entry for very small businesses is going to be very high because a lot of debt is going to be incurred. A lot of, leases are going to have to be broken, etc. And so I think the government will need to conceive of something that is getting you back into the game kind of support.
Very interesting. JP.
One of the things that CCAB has worked very hard on for years is around supply chain, kind of picking up a little bit of what Rodney's talking about, but actually being very targeted in the way that you actually go to your supply chain. Federally, the government spends in its supply chain less than 1%, typically down 0.3 to 0.4% of their money on Indigenous SMEs. So that has to change. They did recently set a target of 5%, which would increase the spend on Indigenous SMEs from under $65 million to $1 billion a year. If you have the best widget in the world or a service, if you can't get it to market, and Indigenous entrepreneurs have had a harder time getting into a lot of the government supply chain. So being very pointed in the way that governments actually supply their goods and services from an Indigenous perspective, because the governments are amongst the biggest procurers. If we can actually get every government, to municipal, provincial, territorial, federal, to commit to a 5% spend, that would contribute over $23 billion to the Indigenous economy. Being very pointed, and I know CCAB is still very active on that file.
Prescriptive is good. When we started Canada 2020, our first conference was called Progressive Policies, Practical Solutions. So it's good to have something prescriptive. Sandip, on your end, what do you think? What supports do you think might need to stay in place for a while, if any?
Yeah, no, on the wage side, I think that folks are really counting on that as a stabilizer. At what point do you wean businesses off that? Business is very much aware of the fact that, there's choices, like in our calls and our webinars, they come out of the topics come as a result of those calls. Insolvencies and restructuring and debt are things on top of mind of these business owners. And so they are looking at and going, if this stops, then what? And it's more debt, and debt forgiveness and abatements and things like that are being talked about. And I think that's the policymakers and the government needs to be looking at the fall and saying, well, what are we looking at here in October? Because a lot of the debt and things like that. So that's why I think BDC coming out with a 2-year, with a slower repay and an interest like that really helped provide some clarity. It's now a matter of trying to get to that funding, but can we provide that kind of 2-year trajectory on these programs? And that'll help the businesses. And so, because we're seeing the same thing, 2022, 2023.
Thanks. So Michael, you don't actually get to answer those questions. Everybody was just giving you work for you to do. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. But no, I think those are very concrete ideas. And you've got some good ears here at BDC. Michael, you folks are really at the pointy end of what supports might be in place for people going forward. You must be hearing things. What are people asking for? I'm again, not binding you from a policy perspective on a go forward, but what do you think what are people asking you for? Does it mirror a lot of what you've heard from your fellow panelists here today?
Yeah, no, it does. And as Sandip was saying, there is a limit to, appropriately so, to how much debt any SME or entrepreneur wants to bear. And whether it's a bank debt or in effect debt from extending payables to your suppliers, it is debt, has to get paid back. And I think there's a limit again to how much companies can bear of that. So The solution would need to be something else. But it's such a good question because it gets to so many trade-offs we have to make, right? And the trade-off between slowly getting back into business for public health reasons versus going full throttle, which would address a lot of these concerns that businesses have. And then more macroeconomically, at some point, the trade-off between increasing the size of our debt for future generations versus kind of spending it now to keep enterprises going. So one simple question that was asked gets into all these really challenging trade-offs that we have to sort through. And that's just what life's going to be like for, I think, policymakers and engaged citizens in the months and years ahead.
Sure, that's right. And that's what this recovery project is all about. I'll do one quick final tour de table for everybody. I want to thank everyone for joining, thank our panelists today. I'm going to give you this is a quick go around. I like to do this when I have a panel. I'd like to know what you're optimistic about. Ken Wong, who's a Queen's University business prof, talked about survive, revive, and thrive for Canadian business when it comes to the COVID pandemic. So I'm going to focus on the thrive right now. What's the one thing you think SMEs, that you're optimistic about for SMEs in the thrive portion of what we hope to get to in time? So Sandip, I'm going to start with you.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, no, I'm optimistic because of the grit and determination of our business community. And we're all trying to lead with empathy and humanity. And I think that is why we will thrive if we still just keep asking for help, be transparent and agile. And that's one of the reasons why we launched a toolkit of relaunching your business. So it's available to everybody because it's on our website. And
what's your website?
CalgaryChamber.com. So and it says COVID resources toolkit. And that toolkit came together because people were transparent, led with empathy, and wanted to have a strong sense of community. And that's why I think we will thrive.
Super, thank you. JP, your optimism is focused on, tell us.
Well, we've had to innovate, we've had to do things differently, like case in point, what we're doing right now. And I'm hoping, you can't replace a handshake and time sitting around having some moose meat with your colleagues up north, as an example. But certainly when you've got those relationships, I think we're going to do things differently, which is going to save a lot of time and resources. But also, you look at the air, you look at the water, look at the animals coming into our cities. Hopefully, we pick up and we remain innovative in the way that we approach business in the future, that we can actually keep a bead on the environment a little closer, as well as the life balance, spending more time with family, those things that make us human, that actually bring energy into our lives and we exude when we go out to do business instead of hitting burnout like many of us do.
No, that's right. That's right. Rodney, your optimism is on.
I was looking at the stats that I didn't get to, and on the happy side, construction, wholesale, and manufacturing, their numbers are actually very steady, holding very steady, declining, but not precipitously. The sad side is that personal services, food, and accommodation have dropped 20% year over year. And I think, and that by the way, is the sector we play in, is your service sector. Mm-hmm. And I think those small businesses that are in the service sector are going to reinvent themselves through a digital lens. I think everyone that has pivoted to digital quickly is surviving, and they're going to provide a really interesting example that will start to create other new business models around digital that just haven't found a reason to modernize.
All right. And Michael, final word for you on optimism.
So my final words, this past weekend in Omaha, Warren Buffett had his virtual meeting, and the big theme of it was never bet against America. So what I say here is never bet against the resilience of the Canadian entrepreneur. It's remarkable how resilient entrepreneurs in this country are. And you see every day, you hear stories of pivots and new products and PPEs being made by Canadian entrepreneurs. And I spend my time with them. They're a very resilient bunch, so never bet against them. And if there's a way through this and a way to take a business in a new direction, they'll find it. And that's what underpins my confidence.
That's great. I like to hear that. Well, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. I'd like to thank everyone that joined us online. Thank you for giving us your time, your questions. Please stay tuned to the Recovery Project. This is a fascinating project launched by Canada 2020 and the Institute for Fiscal Studies and Democracy and Global Progress. Some good thinking is happening. As you can see, there's an opportunity to to feed in your ideas. We have great ideas coming from our participants and great ideas from people who send us questions. So we're all about this country recovering from this nasty pandemic, and I'm glad to see some optimism here. Thanks again, everyone, for your time. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mama P.
Stay safe.
Thanks.